Hello and welcome to the Editorial, where we discuss our controversial videos and talk about some of the mistakes we might have made across the last few weeks.
Yeah.
I'm joined today by Zach Michaelis, our Editor-in-Chief. How are you doing?
Thank you very much. Yeah, very, very well. Ready to apologise.
Yeah.
So there we go.
Yeah. So when was the last time, because I haven't hosted this before, so when was the last time
No, you haven't.
we did
What a
an
treat
episode? I know,
for the viewers. The last time was 2 weeks ago, so we aspire to have this every 2 weeks, but
Yeah.
in practice, as you probably know, it doesn't happen every 2 weeks because either Jack or I are invariably away, and Jack is away at the moment. Well, sort of, you know.
Yeah.
And so you're filling in. So we're
Yeah.
really trying our hardest to get the editorial out
So-
every 2 weeks.
How many sort of controversial videos have there been since the last episode?
So I think there are at least this is great, at least two.
Okay.
And one of them came out today.
Yeah.
And I think that's the one that we should probably start with.
Okay.
Actually, maybe three. We'll go for three. Let's go for three. A nice even three, one on each channel.
So the one today was on the Nova Kakhovka Dam.
Yeah. And yeah, the title of the video is Why Russia Blew Up the Nova Kakhovka Dam. And the video was mostly about why the evidence strongly suggests that the Russians did indeed blow up the dam. There's this sort of blame game going on between the Russians and the Ukrainians, as there always is when something like this happens. But the evidence really overwhelmingly does suggest that the Russians did do it. I think actually what's probably maybe the most likely thing is that the Russians, as we mentioned in the video, the Russians actually wanted to do a small hole in the dam and just ballsed it up. Because that would have been the optimum outcome for them. They would have flooded the islands that the Ukrainians were using for the amphibious landing and around Kherson. And without cutting water supplies to Crimea or sort of provoking this massive international backlash. But we make a couple of mistakes in this video, and I think if you've already seen the video or read the comment that we pinned, this is going to be sort of just rehashing that.
Yeah.
But as I see it, I think we sort of make two glaring errors, maybe three. The first one is that we say Kherson city is occupied by the Ukrainians. This is obviously just a slip of the writer's tongue, as it were. And it's just that I had been saying that Russia was occupying. Of course, Kherson is Ukrainian, so it's not true to say that it's occupied by the Ukrainians. It's sort of liberated or controlled by the Ukrainians. And that's just a mistake on my part, and I am very sorry about that. So
that's just a language. That's a sort of a language error, really.
Yeah, it's a semantic, but it's also significant.
No, of course.
So yeah, that is a mistake. And then later on in the video, we say for most of the war, Russia refrained from striking civilian targets. Obviously, this is what's caused most of the upset, and it's completely wrong. You know, I mean, this is of course trivially untrue. Like, we covered all of this at the beginning of the war. You know, Russia's been striking civilian targets since the war began. What we were just trying to communicate there was that there was this uptick in attacks on civilian infrastructure, especially after the counteroffensives in Kherson and Kharkiv at the end of last year. And that's when the Russians changed command. And the guy who took over, Surovikin, is that? I think it's pronounced like that, spelt like that. I've never said it aloud.
Welcome to my world.
Yeah, I know. He's renowned for his sort of brutality in places like Syria.
Yeah.
And he has been more directly attacking stuff like the Ukrainian energy grid, for example. So actually, until October, the Russians did avoid striking the Ukrainian grid. And this is something that, like, very, very aggressive Russian nationalists were very grumpy about at the beginning of the war. So people like Igor Girkin were telling the Kremlin, basically via their Telegram channels, that they're not doing enough. They should be, striking Ukrainian hospitals and schools and the grid. And for at least the first few months, the Russians didn't do that. I think presumably because Putin was hoping that it'd be a quite easy victory, so he could keep the Ukrainians on side, as it were. And when it became apparent it wasn't going to happen, and when he got Surovikin in the mix, they switched to just more aggressively bombing civilian infrastructure. So that's what we're trying to communicate there, and that's just a complete mistake on my part. And the point I was trying to make there is that the attack on the dam, if indeed this was the intended effect, suggests that the Russians are escalating further in that direction.
Sure.
Yeah. So they are just trying literally everything to, as it were, defeat the Ukrainians or the Ukrainian army on the battlefield. And it does suggest that they're quite desperate in a sense, if indeed that was the intended effect.
So this was an under-explanation, if anything, of sort of simply saying, they're not attacking.
Yeah, it was an under-explanation, but it was also just missaid. Like, there has to be a qualification in there somewhere, like it shouldn't be civilian targets, civilian infrastructure would be better language, and refrain to some extent would probably be a sufficient qualification there instead of just saying refrained in the absolute. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, we made a mistake there. And then the last thing is that there's been some pushback for the fact that we describe it as special military operation. That isn't, it's hard to communicate because obviously there's this, when I write it, I can't communicate. That's supposed to be narrated in a tongue-in-cheek fashion. You can't write sarcasm. I mean, I guess I could like write a comment or something. But that was intended as a sort of tongue-in-cheek comment. We are not endorsing that description of Putin's invasion. And it should be clear from the way we describe the war in the rest of the video and in all our other videos that we're not just parroting Kremlin talking points about what's going on in Ukraine. But I still think those are sort of the mistakes we made, and there's some genuine errors there, and we are very sorry about that, and that's just my bad, and got to apologise. So yeah, apologies for that. I think the other thing is this is an explanation, not an excuse, but I think there's quite a lot of stuff about people saying that we should we should edit these things more and take more time, and I completely agree, and I really am sympathetic to that point of view. It is just that because everything is happening so quickly and on the fly, and we are trying to keep people up to date, we are slightly rushed. Because you're writing stuff sort of as it happens. And that's an explanation, not an excuse, and we can still do better. But that it just sort of slightly increases the risk that we're going to make sloppy errors. And, some people argue that actually we should just take another day and have the video out the next day. Yeah, it's possible that you might be right about that. I think two things. One, there is just a commercial incentive, like videos that come out more timely, just do better. And also that would mean we could do less coverage. And we're trying to keep people as updated as possible on what's going on in the counteroffensive. So we had the counteroffensive video yesterday. We have the dam video today. I'm currently writing another one about what's going on in Bakhmut and Zaporizhzhia. So yeah, I think it's just the sheer volume of content, Ukraine counteroffensive related content does just mean that there's a higher chance of errors. And I am really sorry about that. And we will try our hardest to avoid it. But I think they're just sort of almost by necessity, a slightly higher error rate. Yeah, that's fair?
I think that's fair, yeah. I think that the nature of how we do things as well, I mean, it is news at the end of the day, and we don't have the team the size of BBC News or anyone like that who can labour over it and get a video out quickly. And the nature of the game in news is to get things out quickly, unfortunately. And, because we're independent, because, we don't have backers, etc., we don't have a team, as big as other news outlets that would be able to work on this simultaneously and maintain content getting out quickly. So unfortunately, that is just a byproduct of the size and nature of the business. Yeah,
and some people often say, like an editor should catch the stuff. And I completely agree with you. I should be catching stuff. I am sorry about that. But I'm acting as editor and writer. So it's quite, it's odd to edit your own stuff. And I try to edit on the fly, but sometimes stuff does slip through. But again, it's not actually, I still want to make this clear, it's an excuse, explanation, not an excuse. Sure. And we still shouldn't be making those mistakes. And I really hope that in the next video that comes out, will probably come out on the same day this comes out, about Zaporizhzhia and Bakhmut, hopefully that won't have any errors in it in the way this did. So I think that's enough on that. Yeah. I think, to be honest with you, the pinned comment covers most of the ground there. And we're sort of just rehashing that. But we'll go on to the next one. The next one is the US debt ceiling crisis explained.
Yeah.
And I think that the mistake that I made here was it was just too opinionated, and we are supposed to be a neutral channel. And I think here I basically argued that the debt ceiling is pointless. And I actually sort of stand by the arguments presented there, but tonally it was just too partisan.
So what was it, just to catch me up on this, because I saw today's, I saw I remember narrating the debt ceiling one. I remember it being, I know that we've had conversations on the discussion, etc., and I know what your take is on the debt ceiling. What was presumably it was people that didn't agree with your argument.
Yeah, I think some people didn't agree with the actual substance of the argument. I think other people just expect us to be more neutral in the way we present information.
Right.
And I think that's what they're pushing back against. And I think that's entirely fair. So again, I'm going to apologise. I am really sorry about that. That was too partisan.
For my curiosity, more than anything else, what was the argument against? Like, what was your take was that there doesn't need to be a debt ceiling. You know, most countries just, we won't get back into it, but most countries.
Well, yeah, most countries, your legislature tells the executive to do two things, tax and spend, and then you borrow to make up the difference. And if you want to reduce debt, then you should tell it to spend less or tax more, not rely on this sort of inherently a bit paradoxical debt limit.
And what was the argument? Because that's your argument on this. What is the argument against that? That people, presumably, at least some people in the comments were saying, look, I just don't. That take is incorrect.
So I think there are two arguments against it. I think there was a slightly confused argument against it, which is the one that's most often made, which is made by sort of fiscal conservatives who are uncomfortable with the amount of debt that the US is accumulating. And they basically just say that debt is bad and this is a good way to keep down debt.
Okay.
Maybe, but
you can keep down debt with the other two mechanisms. You don't need the debt ceiling.
That's what I'm talking about. So like, and clearly the debt ceiling doesn't work if that's the aim of it, because the US is one of like how many countries with a debt ceiling, and yet it has a ballooning deficit. And actually, really, we're not going to get into this in too much detail now, and we don't get into this in the video, but there are very deep structural reasons why the US has to run a deficit, to do with the openness of its capital markets and the fact that certain countries, including places like China and Germany, run enormous capital, but they basically run surpluses, and they have to park that capital somewhere, and they park it in US denominated assets, and that's just how the global system of finance works. And it's the debt ceiling is almost sort of like it's just this constitutional quirk that just makes the inevitable more difficult and more chaotic. This is my take. So this is the problem here, is that I am giving a take here. Like, sure, it's economics, but economics is still political in a sense, and I'm still pushing an argument. And I don't think I didn't present the argument fairly. I was too partisan, and I actually accept that point. I do think the language was too sort of hawkish.
So there were some comments that were just saying.
Oh yeah. So the other argument, by the way, against it is that some people argue that debt ceilings are useful veto points. So
right, okay.
Even if you're not necessarily inherently against higher debt, you might think that the debt ceiling is a good veto point insofar as it shifts the balance of power in the American political system towards Congress. And
So I suppose the argument there is that yes, it is in a sense paradoxical, and it is, you accept, but it does hold the government at gunpoint. And
exactly.
It does. And this chaos that has been caused actually does have a benefit in the sense that it.
But I think if you want to make that argument, if you want to make the argument that Congress should have even more power and even more veto power in the American political system, as I mentioned in the video, I just think that's implausible. Like, the American system is already one of the most veto heavy in the world. Like, it's so dysfunctional. Like, the idea that you want another veto to give basically another form of blackmail, another gun to the head of the president. That's just, to my mind, that's just madness. But again, this is to my mind. So what I should have been doing there is just presenting that a bit more fairly. There are very smart people who are in favour of the debt ceiling, people smarter than me. And I think it is in part just because I have a strong opinion on this, but I just don't think I presented the information fairly enough.
Do you think that part of this comes from also the fact that, and I suppose this leaks into other elements of our content as well, and that we do come from, we're grounded in British democracy, and that is the way that the lens through which we view things. So whenever I know that there was some time last year where there was some abortion debate in the US, and obviously here that is a very, very different, it's not a debate here really, whereas it is in the US, and it will always come back around to this on occasion, because our lens, our Overton window is very much UK centric. It's very much calibrated for the UK, really.
I think that's.
And when we go to American content, that's where it's. So when you're talking about the dysfunctional nature of US politics and the fact that it has, so many vetoes and things, is that partly because in the system that we have, that is not the case? The legislature doesn't have as many at all vetoes against the Prime Minister and the government in this country.
We have nice, good chat theory of government. None of those hard vetoes.
Which was worked so well.
Yeah. Yes, I think you're almost entirely right. Like, sure, there was a descriptive background to my opinion, and my opinion probably is grounded in the fact that I am, if you can't tell, British. And so
everyone can tell.
yeah. And so I sort of do probably just subconsciously sympathise with our system more than others. And I think you're also right in that there is some deep theoretical sense in which you're always going to have a bias and it's always going to be informed by your circumstance. But at the same time, I do still think that I'm just still optimistic that you can actually still do both sides. And in this one, I just don't think I did both sides. Okay. So, like, I think a good example, I agree with you on the abortion one. Like, the abortion one, I think, a really interesting, a really interesting manifestation of that was that Andrew Neil interview with Ben Shapiro.
Yes, I remember this interview very well.
When he described it as barbaric, he described like
and then he called Andrew Neil left wing.
Yeah,
in that
exactly.
interview.
Yeah, well, Andrew Neil described it, I think, the particular abortion practices in parts of the US as barbaric.
He did.
And it's just such it's a clash of cultures there.
Yes.
You're right, something equivalent is going on here, maybe. But I still am optimistic that you can do both sides. So I think a good example is our transport debate video that we did in the US ages ago. The trans debate doesn't have as much heat in the UK as it does in the US, I don't think. Yeah, I mean, sure, it's a hot topic, but it's not. The US is different gravy in that respect.
I mean, Scotland is a good example of where.
But that was a constitutional debate mainly.
That was mainly.
If you look at the DeSantis language,
sure,
and the Trump, it's just.
I agree. I agree that the US it's more heated, but I still think it's fairly heated here.
Fine, but even more, the point that you're more heated, and
sure.
I still think that there we covered the subject with sufficient care that we did both sides. People were happy with it. Whereas here, you might be right. It might be an expression of my sort of provincial Englishness that I hate the debt ceiling so much.
Yeah,
but I.
Let the government get on with it.
Even if that's true, I still just should do better when it comes to presenting both sides.
Okay,
and I don't think I did well.
That's what I was going to say. Just last thing on this video, which was that I presume there was also a contingent of the comments that weren't just presenting an argument against you. It's simply the point that you were making an argument, and that's not what we do.
Exactly,
and that's the.
I'm very sympathetic to that, and I think frankly people are right about that.
And actually, I said last thing, but this is the last thing.
You're actually quite enjoying this, aren't you? You didn't think you were into the editorial.
I do. Yeah. I think that there are situations in which we do actually present an argument, and there are situations where we go, look, to be frank, this is just a bit stupid. And there are situations where we write videos on that, and we say, okay, we kind of are presenting an argument.
The Kakhova Dam is an example. Exactly.
Yes, the facts point in one direction, and I suppose this is a symptom of that in the fact that there will be situations where the audience don't agree that it is as clear cut as we think it is, and perhaps this isn't
it's that thing that the facts have a liberal bias, but the facts have an anti-debt ceiling bias. That's what I'm arguing here.
There you go.
But I still think I made a big mistake in that I did just present it too aggressively.
Okay,
and I think that is entirely legitimate, and I think that explains why it's not doing so well.
So that was
the like-dislike ratio was not great.
Yeah,
not bad. I mean, it's still 96%, but it's below our average.
Yeah. So that was the second controversial video. How many did you say there were? 3?
Sort of 3, but now I'm looking at it. I was going to talk a little bit about the Scottish independence one, the S&P's collapse explained.
I don't remember the backlash to this one either.
There wasn't much. I think the main backlash was that people thought we were overstating how badly the S&P were doing in the polls. The only thing I think I want to say here is that the reason people push back against that is because they saw the graph. The graph's x-axis covered like 3 years, so it was you couldn't really see quite how dramatic the drop was. And if you just sort of narrow that time frame down to like the past 6 months, then you can see how dramatic that drop is. I mean, it's a 15-point drop no matter how you look at it. You know, you are going from 50% of the intended vote in the polls down to 35%, and Labour are going up from 20.
I think you made this point in the video as well, is that it isn't just the implication of vote share as well, it's the impact that 15% will have on seats,
and also the ability of the Scottish of the SNP to pressure Westminster into a referendum. That's what matters really, and that's why I think it's very sceptical, because you might be able to, if you were Nicola Sturgeon, pressure Westminster into forcing an Indie Ref 2 by winning an outright majority at the election and claiming that was a de facto referendum, and so there is sentiment for a second referendum.
But if you're only getting 35%,
you can't.
It's a tough argument.
It was always going to be tough, even with 50%, and they're probably always going to say no. But Sunak can easily say no if you get 35%. He'd laugh in your face. And that's sort of the point I was trying to make there. And the other point I was making is that the trajectory is in one direction. And there was a very, the S&P definitely have a hard base that will not go. Probably about 30% of the Scottish electorate, I would say. But the trajectory is down.
Yeah.
And given Humza Yousaf's personal approval ratings and the fact that there is an investigation ongoing, I don't see it going up necessarily anytime soon. I also just think that there's a sense in which the S&P have always been able to. It's just that basically the current circumstances is just bad for incumbent governments. It doesn't really matter how competent you are. It's tough being an incumbent government in a time of high inflation, and so I think that will hurt the S&P as well. But I think the point there was some people pushing back against that, and some people also pushed back against the idea that support for independence, the fact that it had fallen, was a symptom of the fact that Yousaf had replaced Sturgeon, because actually the decline begins a bit earlier. I think that's true, but I think another way of looking at it, factually, of course that's true, the decline begins a couple of months earlier. But another way of looking at it is that the independence polling sort of goes like this a little bit, and it was just going like this. And the fact that it's stabilised, at whatever it is, sort of 55% no, 45% yes in the last couple of months, I think that is a symptom of the issues that the S&P are having, at least in part. I think as we mentioned in the video, I think there are other reasons.
Sure.
The collapse of Boris Johnson, I think, is a massive one. That his demise has been phenomenally good news for the union. But I think that, of course, the correlation is not perfect, but the fact that the gap has maintained, I think, is related to the S&P's sort of relative decline.
Yeah.
So I think that is actually it.
So there wasn't as much kickback on that one then. I mean,
no,
there was some debate.
97% like-dislike ratio.
And probably the fact that it's me doing the video in an English accent, criticising the SNP, probably doesn't help.
Silly thing people get grumpy about.
No,
English accents
probably
are the
doesn't
best
help.
accents.
We're going to have to do an editorial about this editorial.
But yeah, so I think that's it. So I think just a little recap for anyone who's still listening.
Yeah. There's no one listening.
The most navel-gazing of all podcasts.
Yeah.
Is I am really sorry about. I am really sorry about today's Russia video. Blowing up the Nova Kakhovka Dam. There were glaring mistakes in that, and we shouldn't be making them. Whatever we say about how rushed things are. And I am also sorry about the US debt ceiling one, because I did too aggressively push my point of view, because I just hate the debt ceiling. But that's something I should be able to withhold from the video itself. And on the S&P one, I don't think we made any big mistakes necessarily, but I think that the polling could have been maybe better explored. Okay. So that's that, I think.
It feels like the audience have hauled you in front of like a select committee and you're having to apologise every 3 weeks.
To be a politician. I'm so ready to apologise the whole time.
Yeah. Well, if you want to see Zach apologise some more, he'll be doing it again in 2 weeks' time.
Yeah. Well, hopefully not. Hopefully it's just flawless 2 weeks and I get to finally be smug.
Is there going to be an episode of this where it's just you saying, I've got absolutely nothing to apologise for?
There really should be, shouldn't there?
Yeah. Maybe, is that the aim?
You know what? That has actually inspired me to work even harder. I'm going to make sure in the next 2 weeks that nothing goes wrong, and then I can come on here and mug everyone off.
A cocktail, just sort of done nothing wrong.
Yeah, really rub it in. But anyway, apologies.
Despite that, Zach will be apologising in 2 weeks' time.
Yes, I will be definitely apologising for something or other in 2 weeks' time. I am very sorry. It's sort of half a joke, but actually, no, we shouldn't make mistakes, and we will endeavour to do better over the next 2 weeks.
I, however, have been flawless. So,
what a note to end on. Off, Ben. Cool. That's a good way to end.